Hi, welcome to Church for Skeptics. I want to start today by talking about the Apostles' Creed. The Apostles' Creed was formulated by the church in the 3rd century, which would be the 200s AD. And so it expresses the basic tenets of Christian belief. At the heart of the Apostles' Creed is the gospel, of course. The death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. It's interesting to me that some folks want to say that all religions are the same, but if you read the Apostles' Creed, you'll see that at the heart of the Christian faith are the teachings of Christianity, and they're diametrically opposite to other religions. There's no way that all religions can be the same, though they may have some similarities. Critics, I guess I would say, want to emphasize whatever similarities there are between Christianity. All religions do answer similar questions in some ways, and so there's bound to be some similarity just in the fact that they're all religions. But they tend to ignore what has come to be known as Orthodox Christianity. Orthodoxy's almost become a bad word, unnecessarily, I think. At the same time, they want to emphasize the differences in denominations. I mean by that, you've got, let's say, Baptist, Lutheran, Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, etc. And while there are differences in some of their beliefs, those are minor differences. The very thing that virtually all, if not all, Christian denominations agree on is the Apostles' Creed. There are a lot of denominations that use it. So that's our starting point today, just to emphasize that. And then what we want to get today is the heart of the creed is the gospel. The heart of the gospel is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And while the resurrection is the most attacked of that three-part gospel, death, burial, and resurrection, and naturally so it would be because it's supernatural. That's a big problem for a lot of people. But today we're going to focus on not the resurrection, we've done programs on that, but the death and burial, which, and my motive here is to show that the historical veracity of the New Testament regarding the death and burial of Jesus carries forward into the historical veracity of the resurrection itself. And what we intend to do today is to show that when you put the Jewish nature of the Christian religion and its dependence on Judaism for its existence, when you put that cultural viewpoint back into it, it makes the New Testament fall into place, and it pretty much takes away the skeptical views about the death and burial of Jesus. So I hope you keep watching. Was watching probably around last Easter a program on the History Channel about the life and death of Jesus. The History Channel is good about coming up with documentaries around that time, Christmas time. And it's interesting that they had, for the first part, the life and death of Jesus, they had very skeptical scholars, New Testament scholars, and they actually had a few conservative scholars that they allowed to pipe in. And it's interesting to me, despite the popularity of the very skeptical scholars, the consensus view of scholarship is very much more on the conservative side regarding the historical veracity of the New Testament and so forth. What's interesting to me is that there's no real historian, credible historian, that doubts that Jesus actually lived in 1st century Palestine, or Israel, would be more accurate for my Jewish friends, or that he died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. And we're going to talk about why that happened in just a few minutes. But here's what got me. There wasn't that much disagreement between the skeptical scholars and the conservative scholars until they got to the last part. They talked about the historical evidence for the life of Jesus, for the death of Jesus by crucifixion, and then as they go into segments, the last part, the screen flashes and it says the resurrection. And they didn't have the conservative scholars back, they only had the liberal ones back, and the liberal ones started just shaking their head and saying, the times were very confusing back then, and we don't have a lot of historical evidence, and so nobody really knows what happened, surrounding the events of the death of Jesus. And my frustration was that here, up until the last point, they're using historical evidence and all agreeing of all these events, and then when it gets to the resurrection, all of a sudden there's no historical evidence. They can't do that. If they're going to use historical evidence to show that Jesus really lived, that Jesus really died by crucifixion, why not use the same evidence to show that the best explanation for the events following that, the actions of the disciples, was the resurrection of Christ? Of course, the stumbling block, and I certainly agree to this, the stumbling block for them is that it's a supernatural event that they're wanting to have an explanation for, and almost any explanation would be better than the resurrection, because that involves the direct action of God. But once you concede or allow the possibility that God exists, the resurrection becomes not just a possibility, but historically the probability. As I said, today we're not going to focus on the resurrection. I hope to leave that door open at the end. But even if we did not have the New Testament manuscripts, we would still, from a good handful of ancient historians who lived around the time of Jesus, we'd still have the basic facts that are included in the gospel according to the Apostles' Creed and according to the New Testament. Now, understand what I'm saying here. Without the New Testament, and even without the evidence of the early church fathers that quoted the New Testament so much, we would still know from other historians that Jesus lived, that he was a first century rabbi, that he was considered by many, not just his followers, a miracle worker, that his disciples thought that he was the Son of God, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and that his disciples truly believed that 3 days later God raised him from the dead. We could know all that if we didn't even have the New Testament. That's what the history books would teach about Jesus, based on other historians not involved in the Bible at all. I think that's really impressive. I could give you just a couple of examples, but for the sake of time, Josephus would be one, of course, and of course he was a Jewish historian born around the time that Jesus was crucified. And he said that his reporting of history was that Jesus died the ultimate death under the penalty of Pontius Pilate. Tacitus, a Roman historian, said basically the same thing. So again, what we want to focus on here is the biblical account, and again, my emphasis is there's a thread that runs through skeptical scholarship. And that thread, first thread would be, of course, an anti-supernatural bias. There are no miracles, so we have to explain it some other way. The other thread is that they seem to want to take the whole Jewish culture out of the picture. And that's been the complaint of the more conservative scholars, some of the best ones in the world, about these liberal scholars, like the Jesus Seminar folks, because they want to take Jesus out of that Jewish culture and apply more Greco-Roman kinds of cultural standards to reading into what he said and so forth, and they turn it into something that he absolutely wasn't. I want to start with, and we'll do this in just a second, I want to start with the Luke 24, and if you want to do some homework, get Luke 24, start in verse 13, and read about the account after the resurrection of the disciples who were walking. They were leaving town, leaving Jerusalem on the road to Emmaus, and Jesus' conversation with them. As I mentioned, in Luke 24, it's narrated that after the resurrection, and this is even after the women witnessed the resurrected Christ. They went to the tomb, and we'll discuss that later, but they went to the tomb expecting to put spices on the body so that they could mourn inside the tomb, which was a necessity, and we'll explain that later as well. But even after they told the disciples didn't believe them. They had absolutely no expectation of the resurrection of Jesus. So some of them stayed hidden in Jerusalem, but at least two of them that we know about from Luke 24 basically left town. They were on the road to Emmaus. And the narrative tells us there in Luke that Jesus met them on the road They didn't recognize him for whatever reason, I'm sure by his design. And he asked them, "Where are you going? Why do you look so downtrodden?" And that's important, they were very discouraged. They weren't elated that the tomb was empty. They were discouraged that the tomb was empty. And they said, "Have you not heard of what's just happened in Jerusalem? How the man that we thought was the Messiah who would redeem Israel has been put to death by the Romans by crucifixion, and so we're pretty much out of here. It's all over." And then the Bible says that Jesus opened up the scriptures to them and explained to them from the scriptures how it was necessary. And again, what scriptures is he explaining to them from? The Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, the Torah, the prophets. This is a Jewish scenario here, and this is so important to understand why, and it makes the New Testament so historically verifiable, so trustworthy. That's my big point today, is to use the death and burial to do that. Well, they were so excited, and at some point they did recognize him and knew that he had actually risen from the dead. And their first reaction, I think, is neat. "Did not our hearts burn within us," they said, "while he was explaining to us the Old Testament in light of the actions that have just happened in Jerusalem?" Well, they went straight back to Jerusalem and testified to the rest of the disciples that, hey, this is the real deal. What the women said is true. Our Messiah has risen from the dead. Now, what we want to talk about then are four, not theological reasons that Jesus died, but from an historical standpoint, four political reasons and theological reasons to some degree why Jesus died on the cross. What put him on a collision course against the Romans, number one, and against the ruling priests, not the Jewish nation at all, not the Jewish people at all. This is not an anti-Semitic thing at all. We're trying to make the point it's the opposite of that. It's a Jewish activity here. Well, what put him on a collision course? Well, there were four things that did that, and that's what we want to talk about after he makes his last entry into Jerusalem. Now, if you want to, again, do some homework, we'll take the first of the Gospels. You can do this in any of the Gospels. But take Mark, the first Gospel written, start in Mark 11, and you'll see all these four things take place that led to his crucifixion. Okay, reason number one. When Jesus entered Jerusalem for the last time, he entered on a donkey. Now, if you know your Bible and know somewhat of the biblical narratives there, you know that the masses of people, he was already popular among the people, of course because of his miracles and also because of his teaching, though maybe the miracles were first and foremost. But they put palm leaves in front of him as he was riding into Jerusalem on a donkey and began to praise Jehovah and use the word specifically Hosanna, which comes from the Aramaic text in Psalm 18 that they would have been very familiar with. Well, what they were all excited about was that Jesus was coming into Jerusalem as their king. He takes his cue as to riding on a donkey from Solomon, who in 1 Kings does exactly the same thing. Solomon entered Jerusalem on a donkey. They saw him as the coming king. Now, the connecting thing to that is he's also fulfilling a prophecy that the Jews would have been very familiar with in Zechariah chapter 9, I think it is, verse 9, if you want to look it up, where Zechariah prophesies that the Messiah will come as a humble king riding on a donkey. So here is a major statement to start his last entry into Jerusalem, where he's proclaiming himself king and the people are agreeing with him. Now, that presents a problem, number one, to Rome. And you remember later that the ruling priest said to the Roman authority, Pontius Pilate, "We have no king but Caesar." But it also presents a problem to Herod, who is the appointed king of Israel under Roman rule. It also presents a problem to the ruling priests because they're about to have their authority usurped by a new king. That's the first problem, and it sets him already on a collision course. Now we get to problem number two. Problem number two. When Jesus enters Jerusalem on a donkey, and having made a statement that he's the king, he goes straight to the temple. And this is a pretty famous story, so you know how that Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple. There was actually a racket going on where people would bring their sacrifices to the temple, and it was just an automatic. Whatever sacrifice animal they would bring had to be without blemish And there would be ruling priests there who would examine the animal to see if that was the case. They would always be turned down, rejected. And so then they had to go to the money changers and get money, exchange something for money and get ripped off to go buy an animal that didn't have a blemish so they could make their sacrifice. Well, Jesus was angered at that, and he overturned, he took absolute authority there in the temple. And here's what he said. He said that, and he's quoting two passages of Scripture, one from Isaiah and one from Jeremiah, and he puts them together, and he says, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people," not just the Jews, but all people. "But you," who's the you? The ruling priests, "have turned it into a den of thieves." Well, there you go. There's the collision course solidified. So now he's got the Romans, the ruling priests, King Herod, all out to get him because of his actions as he rides in, taking authority as the king, and he's already presented himself. That's problem number 2. Problem number 3. After the incident in the temple, Jesus then proceeds to tell a parable, usually called the parable of the vineyard. He's taking this from Isaiah chapter 5. If you want to read it, again, homework, first 5 verses, I think, in Isaiah chapter 5. But this parable of the vineyard has historically been a condemnation of the temple itself and the ruling priest in the temple. Keep in mind, Isaiah is giving this parable historically right before the destruction of the first temple built by Solomon, which took place in 586 BC as a result of the Babylonian siege. So Jesus uses the same basic parable to describe the current events that he's living under and the current situation with the ruling priests and the temple and the racket there. So he's pronouncing judgment through this parable against the temple itself. Well, you can imagine how well that went over with the ruling priest and the king, King Herod had spent, in current terms, billions of dollars on restoring that temple. So that's problem number 3. So to review quickly, he's come in as a king. He's taken the authority as a king and pronounced judgment on the temple and the ruling priest. Problem number 4 is, right after that, he is anointed by a nameless woman. He says she'll be named wherever the gospel is preached, but she anoints him. Now, there's some objection to that because she anoints him with some very costly perfume, and he says she has anointed me in preparation for my burial. And the burial is how we're going to finish this program. Immediately after that, so you've got 4 incidents here, immediately after that, and I think it's so interesting, that's when Judas, Mark says, leaves to go report. He's already planned to betray his master, but he leaves to go and give the report of these incidents to the ruling priest, who then, of course, try to exercise the plot to bring Jesus to death. Now, they have to take him to the Romans to do that because it was against the law, against Roman law, for the Jews to execute capital punishment. So if anybody was going to put Jesus to death, it was going to be the Romans. And if the Romans were going to do it, it was going to be by crucifixion. Again, put the Jewish culture, the Jewish faith, the Old Testament narrative back into this, and it all falls into place. So now we want to talk about the burial of Christ to finish this program up. And I'm just going to have to rely more on my notes and give you some bullet points here. But again, it just all makes so much sense as to why the women were so upset when they got there to the tomb and found it empty. So let me just give you those bullet points as best I can. The vast majority of historical critics, biblical scholars, agree or concede the fact that Jesus was crucified, of course. And there's a little more criticism against the idea of him being buried in a tomb. But again, when you put the Jewish nature of these events back into it, it all falls into place. Number 1, let's just make this point. The disciples were the last people in the world to have invented a story about the crucifixion of Jesus. It was an embarrassment to them. It was a very great disappointment to them. It was a shameful death. It was called a slave's death. That's what it was called. It was the death of a criminal. That's why Paul, I think, in Philippians 2 says that Jesus took upon him the form of a slave and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. So we need to understand something at this point about Jewish burial practices. And here's the big one here. If you can get this, the rest of it will fall into place for you. Number one, the Jews buried their dead. And here's the point I want to make. By law, and from Deuteronomy 21, you can go back and read it, they had to bury their dead before nightfall, lest the entire land be defiled. That's the commandment. They even bury their enemies in battles before nightfall, lest the whole land be defiled. Now, that brings us to the next point. Having been crucified, his disciples had fled. Who would have the greatest responsibility to make sure that according to the Jewish law, Jesus was buried before nightfall? Well, that would be the very same people who wanted him crucified, who asked for him to be condemned, the Sanhedrin, the ruling priests of the day. Now Joseph of Arimathea comes into play and makes everything fall into place again, makes sense. Who better among the Sanhedrin to take charge of the burial of Jesus than a Sanhedrin member? Joseph was a member of the Sanhedrin who was also probably the only one who was somewhat sympathetic towards Jesus. So the narrative is he goes to Pilate, begs the body. Pilate was glad to do that because the Roman law was to allow the Jews to carry out their customs. Here's another point. Jesus could not be buried in a place of honor because he was crucified as a criminal. Now, it's doubtful to me that his family would have had any kind of burial plot or cave in Jerusalem itself, but the custom was to bury the person before nightfall. His body would have been washed and anointed and wrapped in linen and then buried and left alone. Nobody would touch it lest they be defiled for a year. After a year, they could go back and get the bones, after all the flesh had decomposed, take the bones back to a bone box in the family plot, let's say, and they're called ossuaries, and they're found all over Jerusalem. So that happened. So when he's buried, number one, the Sadducees, because of their laws about burying people, had tombs set aside for that purpose. That's why the women, and according to the scriptures, that's what they did. That's why they had to make sure that they knew exactly where Jesus was buried, because they wanted to, at the first opportunity, anoint his body with spices, because being a criminal, they weren't allowed to carry out their 7-day mourning process in public, but they could do it inside the tomb. That meant they needed desperately to anoint the body with spices, lest the stench be just too great for them. So they arrived. The first opportunity was Sunday morning. Think about that. The first opportunity these women have, who had marked the tomb, they came Sunday morning with the spices, and their shock that the tomb was empty was this. If they could not identify the body on the third day, decomposition would set in. They would not be able to identify the body of Jesus. Hence, he would never be mourned, and then they could never come back a year later and gather his bones to take them to his family's burial plot. So that was why they were initially so disappointed. That's why the disciples were disappointed, because they couldn't believe he had actually risen from the dead until he revealed himself to them. So that's why the question was, where have you taken his body? Please tell us. They asked what they thought was the gardener. Fortunately, they didn't have to find Jesus. He found them. And he's been finding people ever since. We leave the resurrection sort of open-ended here. But it's obvious that something transformed a group of hidden, unbelieving disciples into bold witnesses that proclaimed the resurrection. So, understanding this significance of the third day, I think, is very helpful. And keep in mind that if Jesus was crucified, some would say on Thursday, I kind of still think Friday, but the first opportunity, whether you say Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from, if you take Jewish terms here, dusk on Saturday until Sunday morning. Sunday morning was the first opportunity for the women to come. Their reason for coming, they had no expectation of a resurrection. Their reason for coming was to mourn the body of Jesus, mourn his death. It's interesting also that in Jewish culture at that time, they thought that the soul actually stayed close by the deceased body for 3 days, but when decomposition begins to set in, the body becomes unrecognizable and the soul leaves. So the crescendo, if you will, of the mourning process was the 3rd day. So they come to the tomb looking for the body. They know exactly where to go, and they even talk about who's going to roll the stone away for us, who's willing to do that, can we get help. And when they find the tomb empty, they panic until they see the resurrected Christ, of course, and get the message from the angels. If we go back to get a little context here to close, Lazarus had the same situation. If you remember in John, the story of Lazarus who died, who was a good friend of Jesus, and Jesus delayed his coming until specifically after 3 days. He wanted to wait until the body had started to decompose. Martha and Mary, Lazarus' sisters, were very disappointed that he didn't come, and they even said, had you arrived earlier, you could maybe have raised him from the dead, because in their mind, his soul would have still been there. Jesus proved that that didn't make any difference, that he could resurrect Lazarus and call the soul back to be in the body. It didn't matter about the 3 days. And so when you put all this into context, what I really want to show here is that the New Testament is so historically reliable, and when you take into consideration what we know from other writings, rabbinical writings, historical sources, Josephus would be a great one, about Jewish law, Jewish culture, then you understand why he was put to death, what the problems were, how he took the authority of a king, and of course was a great political threat then. And then in the burial, how they were simply following the practices. It's amazing to me how the greatest responsibility for his burial rested on the very people who had accused him and had him condemned. You can trust the New Testament to be historically reliable. Take it all the way through the resurrection. He's still finding people today, just like he found those women on that 3rd day. Thanks for watching.